Hi, welcome. My name is Brian Mills. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Met, and I'd like to welcome you all to our campus. It's wonderful to have you all here. As I look around, I see we've got alumni here. I've got parents of alumni here. We've got some of my former colleagues are in the room, which is lovely to see, and I'm so glad you all could make it here to join us this afternoon. I've been here for 27 years, and I'm proud to say I'm one of the founding staff members here at the Met. There's only a couple people like our founder, Dennis, who's been with us for much longer than that. Just to give you a little bit of background about where you are, the Met High School is a network of 6 small schools, and it includes our Public Street campus, which you're on today. We have a small campus on the West End, and we have a campus in the East Bay. We currently have about 800 students enrolled, and they're all working on individual learning plans that they develop themselves to create a unique process of gaining a high school education. Walking around the Met, you'd probably hardly recognize this as a traditional high school or any kind of high school. We have no lockers, there's no long hallways, there's no bells, and there's no intercoms. All those pieces that when you automatically think of high school, those are the images that pop in your mind. What you'll find here is really highly engaged students. They care about their learning. They're the ones working with their advisors, and they're creating these amazing plans to motivate them to do all their best that they can while they're in high school. Students spend at least 2 days a week outside the classroom setting. We encourage them to take college classes and certification programs and internships, and most of them are out of the school at least 2 days a week. And the places you'll find them is places like with veterinarians in research centers, with bakers, with auto mechanics, with landscapers, architects, and all kinds of other careers. We ask them in 4 years to explore their passions and explore what they want to do, and they can change that exploration as much as they like until they find something they really, really enjoy. We've included some data in the package that was given out today so you can understand a little bit more about who we are and what we do. And if you know of any students who you think would be a great fit for the Met, we've put some applications out on the front tables, so please take an application, take it to a family member, take it to a friend, let them know about the work that we do, and after you're done here today, take a walk around our campus and take a look at the wonderful facilities we have. And I hope you enjoy your time while you're here. I'm going to introduce our co-founder, Dennis Litke, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about our program and a little bit more about some other programs that are happening around here.
So I hired Brian when he was 27 years ago, and he's still 20. That's what's amazing, man. So this is great. Welcome to the Met, and what I want to say is it's also the home of College Unbound. And you will hear from one of our graduates. Rodney, you will hear from one of our vice presidents. Keith's daughter graduated from the Met, so we're all one big family. So it's great. And College Unbound is a college for adults. And we meet here in the evening. Students walk in. Our average age is 38 years old. 80% are women of color. They come in, they drop their kids off. We have daycare, they have dinner, and then they belong to a cohort. And they get tremendous credit for their life experiences. I saw a figure today. Most colleges give 11% of their students credit for their life. We give 100% of our students get it. So that's who we are. Any night, Tuesday or Wednesday night, we're in the Justice Building. You're welcome to come if you're hungry and you got to stop by, get some food, and then leave. But College Unbound staff, just stand up for a second. If you know anybody, you can clap for them too. If you know anybody that this program would go for, there's a card on your table. We're always recruiting, as Brian did. You can take a picture of it. So I also want to thank Cortney. Her nice-sized group in her organization went through and got their bachelor's degree there. So, and the mayor's always supporting us. So that's enough. Carry on. Get them everyone up here. Give me a hand and I'll get out of here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Kyle Bennett. I'm Director of Policy and Equity for United Way of Rhode Island, and I would like you to give another round of applause to Dr. Licky here. Doc. I remember him as one of the first people I met coming back to Rhode Island. I was in a urban education class at Rhode Island College, and he was talking about this crazy idea to send kids to school where they wouldn't actually go to school. They'd go to work and still learn the same concepts. And I was like, that's never going to work in Rhode Island. We're not going to fall for that. Well, here we are today. And not only did we fall for it, it's actually thriving and growing and spread across the country. The model for success was created, and it's gone onward and upward. So I just want to say congratulations on not just crafting a great vision, but really making it come to life. And as we talk today about financial literacy and breaking the economic barriers that have prevented us from achieving equity and financial freedom for Rhode Islanders, and particularly communities of color, I want to think about how we use innovative techniques, get out of the box, and ensure that we're taking a collective approach to success. So with that in mind, I would like to, again, thank Doc. I'd like to thank Brian for his support and leadership in this space, and certainly for hosting us today. I would like to thank the City of Providence, the mayor, and the entire team that has been working on this, for not just this forum, but really the idea of economic empowerment and enablement for the entire tenure of the term. And one last piece, I'd like to introduce my boss, my president, Cortney Nicolato. As you do, Cortney is an executive leader with over 20 years of professional experience in marketing and business strategy. She works to achieve the revenue and mission-based goals of employers, to grow market share, as we've seen through our experience, and build donor relationships. She's experienced in transforming and modernizing nonprofit organizations. We're going through that now. We're calling them growing pains, getting into the modern century. But she's also a noted author and thought leader content and organizational leadership and transformation. Under Cortney's leadership, United Way of Rhode Island launched its bold 5-year strategic plan, which centers everything we do on racial equity. As we welcome and address some of the pressing systemic challenges in our community and state, we are very pleased to have Cortney at the helm and invite her to join us today. Cortney Nicolato.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is such a joy to be in a school. For folks that don't know me personally, I'm happiest around students. I'm a trustee at the University of Rhode Island, and I am an adjunct professor at Northeastern University in their nonprofit management program. And so this is where folks shine, folks explore, folks grow as humans as well as students. And so thrilled to be here and have this as our place in our space for today's discussion. And so thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here to talk about this important topic. I'm so grateful. I'm also grateful to Brian and the Met for having us. So fun fact, Brian is the husband of our beloved team member, Rodney Davis, and so thrilled and thankful for him. And I asked him, I said, were you voluntold that you had to do this? And he said no, so I think we're good. So as we all know, for far too long, systemic inequities and discriminatory practices in education and housing and healthcare has disproportionately impacted our neighbors of color and have made it difficult for our families, particularly our BIPOC families, to generate wealth and experience economic mobility. What we do at the United Way isn't just focused on economic stability, but economic mobility. But the stats are staggering. In 2019, 34% of all Black Rhode Islanders owned a home in the state. And also in 2019, Rhode Island ranked 6th in New England in 4th grade reading level and proficiency. Rhode Island ranks 5th in New England for children under the age of 19 without health insurance. And we know that the numbers are even more abysmal and dismal in our BIPOC communities and neighborhoods. At United Way, we call these unacceptable, and we will not allow it to be pervasive any longer. And that's why you're here, and that's why United Way is committed to this work. In January of 2019, we announced Live United 2025. And our goal and our work, both internally and externally, has been laser focused on changing the status quo, disrupting the system, and centering every single solitary thing we do in racial equity. Our plan was built in concert with the community. We had lots of time breaking bread with our neighbors, our colleagues, and friends to learn what changes folks wanted to see and needed to see in our state. That is how we shaped the plan, and we know that partnership is at the center in ensuring that this works. We cannot break down systemic barriers to bring real change, not just tweaks y'all, but transformative change, unless all of us in this room commit to it. We commit to taking charge, to asking why, to use our voice for good, to vote at the polls. Every single solitary thing that we can do to change the status quo, we must do, and lead the work in equity, trust, and inclusion at all times. At United Way, this is a bold vision, and I will tell you, when we first created it, my team went, "Girl, you're crazy." But it's that what we have to do? Yes. Do we do it? Yes. And that means each and everything that we think about has to be altered. This month, coincidentally, we also launch our annual giving campaign with the goal in increasing philanthropy across the state of Rhode Island. Our theme is simple this year: building hope. By addressing racial disparities alone, we do not accomplish the goal of creating an equitable Rhode Island. We must also inspire hope in others, young and old, Black and Indigenous, from Woonsocket to Westerly, to ensure that the dream of an equitable Rhode Island is available to every resident, regardless of color, ethnicity, zip code, age. And with great pride, United Way loves this work. We really do. We enjoy this work. We enjoy asking the questions. We enjoy building and creating opportunities like this, where we come together to hear from great thought leaders across the state. We're proud to partner with Dr. Akilah Dulin and the Brown School of Public Health on the State of Black Rhode Island report. I know she'll share more about that today, but you need to go directly and read that report. We look inward because our philosophy is we can't practice what we preach unless we do so. And one of those moves that we made in 2021 was to move every single team member up above a livable wage. If we are truly going to work on economic mobility, and we have to practice what we preach. We're proud to invest in organizations who are bringing smart and innovative ideas to the table. We have created programs like the Nonprofit Innovation Lab that helps foster those ideas to become reality. We encourage and work with organizations who are leaning deeply into partnerships like EPI, like Rhode Island Kids Count, as we think about this work. We know that that harnesses a strength that can't be harnessed otherwise. We're also committed to strengthening the nonprofit sector. Nonprofit sector is 16.5% of our workforce here in the state of Rhode Island. Almost 70,000 Rhode Islanders call a nonprofit their professional home. But yet, collectively as a community, we don't give our nonprofit sector enough support. And so we're in the process right now of building a nonprofit resource hub in concert with the nonprofit community that will support the operational needs of small, mid-sized, and primarily BIPOC-led organizations in our state. And that's all why we're here today, to have the bold conversations, to ask the why, to get those calls to action so that we can be relentless in our advocacy and in our work, so that policy change can truly happen when we remove the economic barriers to our fellow Rhode Islanders. So I want to thank Director Stokes. By the way, a day and a half ago he had surgery. I mean, I want to be him. But for sharing his research and his passion. If you've ever heard Director Stokes talk about the work, if you ever heard Keith talk about his passion, Teresa too, It's a beautiful thing to watch, and so I'm so excited that you will all get that experience today. And he'll be talking about an incredibly important topic, and a topic that is important to the United Way, which is reparations. I also want to thank all of our panelists who are rock stars in their own right, in perspectives, and great community champions that you will get to hear from today. And so I hope that you all have a wonderful day in discussion. I also wanted to take a moment to thank Team United, and so you'll see many of the Team United members around. They have worked so hard to orchestrate this in concert with our team at the City of Providence, and so thank you for that partnership, and thank you for all you have done to make today happen. And so it gives me an immense amount of pleasure, to introduce Mayor Jorge Elorza. As Providence's 38th mayor, Jorge has strived to build a Providence that works for everyone. Since taking office in January of 2015, Jorge has led with integrity, with boldness, and long-term thinking about prioritizing communities and opportunities for youth, ensuring transparency in our city government, improving our city services, and providing sound financial future for the capital city. Born and raised in Providence, Mayor Elorza is a graduate of Classical, the University of Rhode Island. I did not know that. You're a Rhody grad? Oh, I love you even more. And a Harvard Law School. Prior to being elected mayor, he was a legal aid attorney. He served on the Providence Housing Court judge. He co-founded the Latino Policy Institute, and he served as professor at Roger Williams University School of Law. We are immensely proud to partner with the mayor and his team to not only host this forum, but on a multitude of different projects that we believe are innovative, smart, and moving the needle, and asking the questions, how can we do things differently? And so, Jorge, thank you for all your support. Thank you for your friendship. And we know that the last few months of your role, you're going to run, not walk. And so we appreciate that as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to start off, pardon the informal dress. I am in my last few months as mayor, and I like to quote my political idol, Barack Obama. He said, entering his last year in office, he said, many people have bucket lists. He said that he had a rhymes with bucket list. But don't let the casual dress fool you. We are absolutely sprinting to the finish line. We've been very busy over the last several months, and we still got a lot of work to do to make sure that the city is in as strong a position to thrive under the leadership of Brett Smiley going forward. I'm excited about the work that's left to be done, and I'm excited about all the new and amazing directions that the city is going to go in. I want to thank Cortney and Nicolato. Cortney, I think everyone here has gotten to know Cortney over the years, and for me it's been a great pleasure getting to know her, not only as a colleague in this work, as a professional, but also as a person. She means it when she speaks, and she puts literally her money where her mouth is. The investments that she's made, sometimes directly and sometimes in partnership with the City of Providence, as she mentioned, are truly moving the needle. And I'm going to ask everyone to please, another big round of applause for Cortney Nicolato and her entire team at the United Way. Now, we appreciate you, Cortney. There are a lot of people that I want to recognize. Dennis Litke, we appreciate you so much. I was listening intently. My ears perked up when you said that you're always hiring. I'm going to be looking for work. Going to have to refresh my resume. But truly, truly appreciate everything that you've done to change and to change lives and to allow young people to become their best selves here. President Bob Carruthers, so yes, I'm a URI grad. I'm a Rhody Ram, and you were the president the 3 years that I was there. And I appreciate you, University of Rhode Island, and everything that you do. Last but not least, I want to recognize my team, Team Providence over here. You know, we are a small but hearty group. You are only as good as your team, and let me tell you, one of the things that I am proudest of in my time as mayor is that, you know, I've been able to somehow surround myself by such amazing, talented, great people that I have on my team. So I say thank you to Team Providence. So, you know, I wanted to share some thoughts, a little bit on the state of the city with respect to economic security, economic stability, but also wanted to share a little thoughts about, you know, where we might go in the future. You know, I'm born and raised here in Providence, 639 Cranston Street, right on the corner of Cranston Street and Waldo. My family, we grew up on the second floor of one of the classic Providence triple-deckers. In fact, we were tenants in that apartment for 22 years. You know, my parents could have practically paid off a mortgage. But they weren't able to apply for a mortgage, at least for our first 15 years here, because my family was undocumented. And you know, all of the economic insecurity that exists throughout the community, you know, double that or multiply that by more when you're undocumented. And so, you know, when I sort of stand outside of myself and I think about the struggles that my family went through, you might think that, you know, it was a lot of hardship, it was a lot of tough times, it was just difficult living. But the reality is that when I look back on it through the eyes of a young child growing up on Cranston Street, you know, my impression was very different. I can remember hanging out with my cousins, you know, many of whom at various occasions lived with us. You know, a packed house full of kids. We had so much fun. We had family. You know, we'd play outside every day. Kids across the street. There were just a lot of kids out there, and we enjoyed each other's company. We actually played outside. However, you know, everything wasn't exactly rosy. You know, I have two very, very loving parents who've been together mostly this entire time. But I do remember that oftentimes my parents would be fighting with each other. And as I think back, I can tell you that virtually every single fight that my parents had, it was money that was behind it. Either one was on the brink of losing a job, or my dad, who was is still a recovering alcoholic, you know, would lose the money, or if there was gambling, or sometimes times are just tough, and they put that economic strain on families. You know, as happy as my childhood was, you know, there's only so much stress you can withstand before it breaks. You know, I count myself as incredibly lucky because as much as my family bent, we never fully broke. But that's not the case for many families in our city today. And you could almost follow a straight line. You know, think of it like this. So let's say you're driving a car. Maybe you're undocumented, and up until, you know, just recently you were denied a driver's license. Or let's say you're driving a car throughout the city, and you happen to have a suspended license. Maybe you have a suspended license because fines and fees have run up. Maybe you got a ticket in Massachusetts that you forgot about. But one day you get stopped by the police. They ask for your license, they run it through the system, and there you realize that your license has been suspended. Or if you're undocumented, you never had one to begin with. You're likely going to get arrested. Your car is going to get impounded. Who knows where you were going? Maybe you were on your way to work, but you're going to miss that day of work. Maybe you're going to lose your job. You're going to have all of the fines and fees that accumulate that you're going to have to pay for. If you do lose your job, you're going to have a hard time paying your rent. Before you know it, you're going to be on the brink of eviction. Eventually, you're going to get those 9-day notice letters. You're going to find yourself in housing court. At housing court, you're going to get railroaded by a process that seems so complicated. And you're going to sign whatever's put in front of you. And next thing you know, your life is shattered. It's turned upside down. So, you know, one variation of that sequence of cascading events that I just mentioned, we all know folks in our community that have gone through those. So blessed with the amazing team, particularly in our policy shop, what we've done over the last several months is we've thought very critically at various stages of the process. How can we intervene in smart ways to prevent people from sliding down this path? And I'm really proud to say, as we were raising money for the Guaranteed Income Program, I was making several calls kind of in the dark. And one of the calls that I made was to Cortney. As soon as I spoke with Cortney, she was like, boom, let's do it. And not only let's do it, but let's leverage these dollars. Let's bring in the Rhode Island Foundation. Let's bring in One Neighborhood Builders. Let's figure out how to get this done. So we were able to launch that Guaranteed Income Program because of all the amazing leaders and partners in philanthropy that we had. Over the last couple of months, we've also announced a new initiative where we've designed this program to help people get their licenses back. Once you realize that you don't have a license and you want to get it back, even if you have the money to pay for it, it's so difficult. Where do you begin and how do you work your way through it? Well, now there are counselors that can get you through that. In the interim, we extended the Guaranteed Income Program by another 6 months, so our families are now going to benefit from it not for 12 months, but for 18 months, and allow them to do a little bit more of long-term planning. We've also announced an initiative that's going to pay for the citizenship application for legal residents who qualify for citizenship. Many folks qualify, but because they can't afford the $1,000 that the application costs, they never go through the process. But because of a creative partnership with Dorcas International, now we are paying their applications so they can become U.S. citizens. And last, I'm also very proud that Providence has recently become one of the few cities in the country that now essentially has a right to counsel in eviction cases. So if you are a low-income tenant who does find themselves in eviction court, now you have someone who's going to represent you in court. And let me tell you that having a lawyer in court is the difference between sometimes winning your case, but even if you don't win the case, giving you enough time to transition to a new apartment rather than having all your stuff thrown out on the street, you sleeping in a shelter, and then the poor tax kicks in. It's just expensive to be poor, and it's almost impossible to dig yourself out. So we try to think strategically and holistically about the needs that our communities are facing and trying to make smart investments to not only lift folks out of poverty, but to help prevent them from sliding down that path. But we're talking about just basic economic stability. What Cortney and what this is about is much more than that. It's about closing the racial wealth gap. So how do we build that stability and then build off of it? Three things rather that I want to mention, and then I'll hand it off. The first is that we are absolutely in the midst of a housing crisis in Rhode Island. Not only are prices getting more expensive, but frankly, I'm not sure there's relief in sight. Over the past 5 years, even though we've had record low interest rates in the City of Providence, do you know that homeownership rates have actually declined? I shudder to think what's going to happen as interest rates remain high and homeownership becomes more and more out of reach for our families. This past campaign season opened up, or I think brought to the forefront, the conversation about rent stabilization. And rent stabilization, I have to admit, for a long time has been sort of a third rail conversation. And I've come to a point where analyzing it simply from a policy perspective and understanding where we are in this housing crisis as a city, this is a policy that we should really take seriously here in the City of Providence. And it's not so much about politicians moving to the left. It's about bringing this idea to the center, because housing is too darn expensive right now, and we need to make sure we make it more affordable for our folks. If we don't, then we're going to become another San Francisco, another Seattle, another Austin, another Boston. All of those cities are thriving economically, but look at the character of the city. Poor folks, artists, immigrants, folks who built their lives there are no longer able to live there. And that's not the city we want to become. So housing, we absolutely have a crisis, and there can be no sacred cows in the kinds of policies that we pursue. Second, we also know that, unfortunately, the reality is that there's still great racial injustice in our community today. After the death of George Floyd, we decided to do something radical in the city of Providence. And the radical idea was to put black voices at the center of city policy making. Every single week for 2 years, we met for an hour and a half, and I participated in every single one of these, with the African American Ambassador Group. This group continues to meet at least twice a month, oftentimes 3 and 4 times a month. And the idea is, let's follow the lead of people on the front lines, let's listen to their ideas, and let them shape city policy. And one initiative that has come out of this African American Ambassador Group that I'm particularly proud of is our Providence Municipal Reparations Program. This would not have happened without the AAAG group. We formed a committee chaired by none other than Rodney Davis. Appreciate you deeply, Rodney. And this committee met for several months, and they put together an 11-point plan of the kinds of investments that we should make as a city. And lo and behold, the investments are all grouped around this overarching theme of building up black wealth, closing the racial wealth gap. So there's deep alignment in this work. We're not only planning, but we've set aside more than $10 million to seed some of this work, and I'm excited to have this move forward. Last but not least, any conversation that we're having about the future of the city, or conversation that we're having about closing the racial wealth gap, has to include a conversation about the schools in the city of Providence. You know, I'm a product of the schools. As Cortney mentioned, I graduated from the University of Rhode Island. I graduated from Harvard Law School. But did you know, Cortney, that I started off at CCRI? And I'm very proud of that. But I'm not proud of what led me to CCRI. I started at CCRI because I got rejected from every university that I applied to. I had nowhere else to go. I'm someone who always had capacity. I felt that I could do the work, but I never applied myself. And I don't blame anyone but myself, but I do have to acknowledge that the schools failed me just as they continue to fail kids today. We've tried this massive experiment where we brought in the state to turn around our schools. I'm still hopeful that our schools do get turned around, but I ask you all with urgency, none of us can or should rest on our laurels and wait for the state, wait for RIDE to come in and save us. It is just not going to happen. And so we have to have this very serious and honest conversation. If the traditional public schools aren't going to get it done, then, well, we have to look for alternatives. We did a recent poll, and it showed that 82% of black and brown families support the expansion of high-quality charter schools. And this, again, is not about, do you support charter schools or not? It's about, we have to invest in what works. Our kids, our families are demanding options now. And as far as I understand it, this is an issue of equity. Families are asking for choice, whereas now choice is reserved only for families with means who move to better districts, who send their kids to private schools, who find tutors or homeschooling for their kids. Poor folks deserve options as well. And this truly is about choice and empowering people on the front lines to make the decisions that they deem as best for them and for their families. So as we head off into this future, we have many, many challenges that await us. But I am so thankful and I'm so happy that we have partners such as the United Way and so many thought partners such as you here today that I know will guide the policy work over the coming years in a way that's true to our values, but also true to the families that live in our city today, that make up our city today, and will, with all of our help, make up our city in the future. Thank you all so much for having me, and thank you for participating in this great forum.
So I knew the mayor was smart and certainly capable, but I didn't know he was psychic. As he was talking about the story of his life, it almost made me think of my own. Many of the scenarios he shared were exactly mine. My dad was part of 3 of the nation's largest strikes. Each time left him unemployed, and that causes stress on a family. I think about the stress that our families are under right now, still in the midst of the pandemic. I'm glad to see Ann here from the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, because we know that that's caused an uptick in not just confrontation, but physical violence, emotional violence, financial violence that our families face. I too was pulled over with an expired license or a suspended license, one of each actually, and surprisingly it was suspended while I was also on URI's campus under Dr. Carruthers' leadership. But I was so excited because I also saw somebody else from the West End who was the state police or campus police officer who pulled me over, and he was a brother. I was like, oh my God, this is great, my lucky day. Except he said license and registration. And I learned something quickly, that having an attorney when you go to court is indeed important, not only for the case ahead of you, but to make sure that the actual casework is done on the other side, so that you leave the court free and clear of any obligation or any indebtedness. So I'd like to thank the mayor and the team for really ensuring that our families have access to quality legal representation, not just legal representation, but high quality, high caliber individuals who are going to look out for their interests, not because they're getting paid big dollars, but because it's the right thing to do and it's who they are. So I want to say thank you and give you all a round of applause for the work that you've done in that space. Next, I'd like to introduce Keith Stokes. Keith is presently Director of Business and Development for the City of Providence. He has a long and distinguished career. I'm sure that most of you know, have certainly been in his presence and heard from him, but he has degrees from Cornell and University of Chicago. His past professional positions have included Executive Director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation, Executive Director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce, and one of my favorite, President of the NAACP Newport chapter. This is an individual who has fought for not just equity and justice, but true financial, educational, and opportunity freedom for people here in Rhode Island, while telling the story of the tragedies that have existed, but also looking forward, as Cortney said, and building hope toward the future. So put your hands together and give Keith a huge round of applause.
Thank you, Kyle, and most importantly, thank you, United Way team, our mayor's policy and communication staff, and most importantly, being back here at the Met School, Dennis. As Dennis said, my own youngest daughter was one of the first graduates of the East Bay Met School, went on to become one of the first female graduates of the Citadel, then on to be a field artillery officer, and she's back in Rhode Island as a reliability engineer, and that was all because of the Met School and the people that believed in her. So being here today and being a part of this presentation, I can't think of a better time, a better place, and better people to begin to have this dialogue and this initiative. What I'm going to try to do is talk about 400 years of racial history in about 20 minutes. But much of it is going to be wrapped around a very exciting and very comprehensive report that was led by many of the people in this room, by, as the mayor had said, establishing a Providence Municipal Reparation Commission. This commission, which included men and women from across the city, from across different political, business, religious, personal interests, came together for the single focus of defining reparations from the history of the City of Providence and moving forward to the present day. And I just want to recognize some of the commissioners that are here. Rodney, who is our chairperson, Kyle, who you just saw, I know Ray Watson's here, Wanda Brown, if I missed anyone. These men and women put in tireless amount of time and effort over a very short period of time and coming up with what I'm going to try in giving them justice is respond to in this report. This particular report, which we call the Providence Municipal Reparations Report, is unique as compared to other reparation initiatives around the country, around the world, into the very fact that by this commission's work, in the case of Providence, reparations is being defined as closing the racial wealth and equity gap. It's not 40 acres and a mule. It's not cash allotments for the transatlantic slave trade. It's recognizing that the transatlantic slave trade and the taking of indigenous land started us on a long path and a legacy that exists to this day, that still people based on race, income, and in many cases in the city zip code are still significantly poorer than and have less access to the benefits of being a resident of this great city, this great state, and this great country. So I'm going to walk you through the history first, then talk a little bit about some of the analysis and planning and policy that went into the report, and then kind of wrap it up on the implementation stage, where we ask all of you to join us in working together to begin to implement these initial dollars as a catalyst to provide long-term sustainable investments in the people, the families, and neighborhoods of greatest need in this city. And I can, as someone who's interacting with these commissions across the country, we're at cutting edge here. How we've defined reparations, how we're focused on present-day inequities, and most importantly, how we're using some initial federal dollars as a catalyst to be able to partner with other public-private partnerships to provide long-term sustainable investments in, again, the people, the families, and the communities of greatest need. So I'm going to try to make sure I'm doing this right. Here we go. So just to give you a summary, this all began almost 2.5 years ago with Mayor Elorza in the belief that there need to be a much more formal and comprehensive response to the George Floyd killing. We saw the country, the world protesting and making the bold statement that Black Lives Matter. But what did Black Lives really mean? And most importantly, from the City of Providence perspective, what were the voices of Black lives in Providence, and how could we bring those communities and those voices forward and be able to articulate what are the best policies and practices and programs to benefit the Black community? So as a part of that process, the mayor had established an African American ambassador group. I was a part of that group, and that group began to involve itself in a number of different activities, including officially having Juneteenth as an official holiday of the city, removing plantations in the city name. And then the third piece was to begin to think about and take on this very complicated matter of reparations, the R word, something that's explosive, it's controversial, it's complex, and it's confusing to many people, black, white, and everyone in between. But the mayor and the AAG, as we call them, wanted to take this on. And on July 15, 2020, an executive order was initiated to create what began as a reconciliation, reparations, and truth movement. The first piece, which is truth, was to provide a platform of having unequivocally clear, documented evidence of racial discrimination, its history, and its prevailing legacy. And I had the honor to work with a number of the city and state historical institutions led by the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. And over a very short period of time, within 6 months, we produced a 300-page document called the Matter of Truth Report. This report documented 4 centuries of racialized discrimination, starting in 1620 and carrying us forward to 2020. What's most important about this report is there are over 675 primary, secondary sources of documentation. It is grounded on evidentiary evidence of racialized discrimination, which began with the taking of indigenous people land, continued with the enslavement of African people, and then continued as new immigrants would arrive, and in many cases discriminated against in the same neighborhoods and even in the same homes and businesses that exist to this very day. So the work of the Matter of Truth Report provided a platform of historical data so that we could understand how Providence or how Rhode Island or how America got to where it's gotten to through racialized discrimination. And I think one of the things that we found in reviewing this historical research was the fact that this taking of indigenous people land, this use of enslaved African people labor, is the very foundation of prosperity in building not only Providence, Rhode Island, but across the Western Hemisphere. In fact, it's free land and free labor that establishes the enormous amount of wealth and prosperity that are still vested in families and institutions, public and private, to this very day. So what was important that we recognize is that this start of economic prosperity was taken from stolen land and stolen labor. And those very same men, women, and families and children of indigenous and African descent, and by the end of the 17th century, they share spaces and households, become almost one people. At no time did they have access to any opportunity to take part in that wealth building. So starting in the 17th century, at the very founding of this city, the very founding of the Western Hemisphere, there is a very organized and very successful and protracted process of keeping people of color, the first people of color of this country, non-white Europeans, indigenous and later African, outside looking in. And that would only pick up momentum and continue and evolve through the centuries. So this report is one of the earliest reports that begins to identify and, most importantly, document this path of racialized discrimination. And one of the things we were able to do in the report, I had the opportunity for the last several years to actually travel backwards through the African diaspora. So I was actually able to take Providence, Rhode Island, African heritage documentation from the 18th and 17th century and go back to places like Barbados, Bahamas, Curacao, Jamaica, even Ghana, and match that up with primary, secondary documents and be able to physically be in sugar plantations in Jamaica and Barbados, where enslaved African men, women, and children worked, and many died, and the few that survived would eventually come to Rhode Island. And those plantations have investors with some of the most prominent Rhode Island family names to exist to this day. I had the opportunity to be in Ghana, in a small town called Ananabo. Ananabo, at that time in the 18th century, was the largest landing spot for Rhode Island slave merchants. The Rhode Island slave merchants that landed at Ananabo, the slave fortress still stands, transported over 150,000 African men, women, and largely children. Most of the Africans that came through Rhode Island ships that eventually survived the Middle Passage from West Africa to West Indies and eventually to Rhode Island and New England were children under the age of 12. But what's most important is to be in Ananabo, to work with the University of Cape Coast, University of Ghana, and see records that directly connected Rhode Island names like Brown, DeWolf, Vernon, Lopez, Rivera, some of the most prominent family names, and those families would found and organize some of the most important and earliest public-private institutions that still exist to this very day in this city and in this state. And what we also found through the documentation of every slave vessel, we found a very curious and very interesting prospect. Rhode Island at that time had no natural-based economy. We have bad land, bad soil. There's no cash economies here. We're not growing sugar or rice or tobacco. We are largely tied to a single commodity, which is the transport of rum, the production of rum from the transport of molasses and sugar from the West Indies. By the mid-18th century, led by Providence, Newport, and Bristol, Rhode Island was producing 80% of the Guinea rum in the world market. And Rhode Island was so extraordinarily efficient in rum production, it was the chief commodity to trade for enslaved Africans along the African coast, particularly in what is today Ghana. The Fanti Ashanti leaders called the Rhode Island merchants rum men because of their proficiency of trading rum and producing rum. So what we call that triangular trade, the trade between the Americas to West Africa, to the West Indies, and back to the Americas, are centered in Providence, Bristol, and Newport. In fact, Rhode Island is the most active slave trading port in all British North America before the American Revolution. Not New York, not Charleston, not New Orleans, didn't even exist as an American city at the time. It's Providence, it's Bristol, it's my town of Newport. And what's most extraordinary in understanding this is Rhode Island, along with other New England, now states after the American Revolution, immediately moves to abolition of slavery. It abolishes slavery by 1784, and then by the early 19th century, Providence, like places like Boston on the North Shore, Newport and Historic Hill, places in Connecticut like in Bridgeport called Little Liberia or New Goree in New Haven, and in Philadelphia, New York, for the first time in the early 19th century, you have a new group of people who have never existed before here in New England in the Northeast, free African people. And almost simultaneously, as slavery ends, a new set of public policies and procedures are put in place to maintain and restrict access and benefits to these free African people. So as slavery ends, policies such as indentured servitude, warning out policies, and the criminalization of homelessness and poverty begin in urban cities, not in the American South, which still is vested in slavery, but in the American North and New England, who had abolished slavery and now are looking for a new public policy control mechanism to control these free African people who dared to now want to live, work, and worship in freedom in communities that they largely built and constructed. We'll get there, it's slow. And in fact, by the early 19th century, we see across the Northeast a series of race riots for the first time in the country's history, this new country, during the antebellum era, the era between about 1815 and 1850, we see a series of racialized riots where almost simultaneously during that period of time, free African heritage communities, and let me step back because I use the term African heritage because that's how they saw themselves. They rejected the term black or Negro or colored. We're African. That's why the first institutions they built were called the African Lodge, the African Church, the African School. They're African. They kept that identity, or they reclaimed that identity once they became free. And in the 19th century, as these free African communities would grow in places like Providence, along the Basin, in Philadelphia in the 7th Ward, in my town of Newport, in what is today Bellevue Avenue, Historic Hill, in each and every one of those communities, they weathered significant, devastating, deconstructing racial riots, where the larger white community went into the neighborhoods, burned down homes, deconstructed homes, displaced families. In Providence, there are 2 racial riots in 1824 in Hardscrabble, an area which is close to around where the train station is, and up towards the south lawn of the State House. And then those surviving African men, women, and families moved further up the hill, a little bit towards what is today the Marriott, and then upwards to Only Lane, which today we see as University Heights. And then in 1831, a second devastating riot where nearly every home was taken down and families were dispersed. And what's important to recognize is this wasn't an isolated event. This wasn't simply racism, drunken sailors. This was an organized process to dismantle, deconstruct, and stop in its tracks a prospering free African community. Through the Matter of Truth report, we were able to extract what today we call letters to the editors, opinions from Providence prominent residents who are consistently saying that any crime, any vagrancy, anything that is negative in our community is tied to Negroes, as what we were called, and particularly women. So you see almost simultaneously across the free North, the free New England in the antebellum era, a whole series of public policies and activities that violently and physically deconstructed black community, black households, and particularly violence to black and indigenous women of color and their families. And as you can see here, by 1832, the year after the Snowtown riot of Only Lane, our first mayor, our now organized and incorporated city, as a part of his address, which is a part of our city archives, he specifically talks in detail about the need to monitor, to control black or colored persons who are at the very center of the disorderly criminal conduct of our city. Within the next year, he now organizes a formal police department. What was going on in the incorporation of Providence and a formalization of a police department in Providence was simultaneously going on in Baltimore, Philadelphia, New London, Boston. Everywhere there were free, black, surviving communities, we now see public policies and law enforcement being used, and specifically used, to keep down, to maintain these non-white inhabitants. So what's absolutely essential understanding this history is the legacies that we see today, the legacies that we marched on for George Floyd, were playing out 150 years before right within this city. And in some cases, sadly, still have not changed. And by the 20th century, slavery, public policies that provided racial riots and discrimination have now evolved into now federal, state, and city policies called urban renewal. And what we begin to see significantly in the case of Providence, by the mid-20th century, as we're trying to invest our way, build our way out of the Great Depression, and FDR leads the effort of the Great Society programs at that time, it begins to establish a stronger federal intervention and investment in getting people out of poverty, out of depression, into middle-class existence, would establish a series of programs and policies that still exist to this day. Departments of Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Commerce, are all established at that time to begin to invest in people in the communities that they live. And one of the most successful of those programs, a part of the National Housing Act of 1934, would establish a program that would allow people to qualify to own their own home. In the 1930s, less than 35% of the entire United States population owned their own home and property. That was a dream that was unheard of for most people. Most people were living in urban tenements or in rural farms as tenants. But it's the FDR administration, the Great Society programs of that time, that begin to believe in a New Deal, as it was called, to begin to establish a fast track for people to have access to a home. And they provided access to low-interest loans and mortgages. They provided mortgage insurance, a tool that would allow the private sector to feel safe in investing in a family or a community that may not have had the financial wherewithal, such as families that have faced slavery and land taking and racialized riots. But we find instead that these programs are being shaped by a new private, later public policy today we recognize as redlining. As these federally insured mortgages and mortgage insurance are being made available through private financial institutions, banks, lenders, insurers, they create their own system of determining who should benefit and receive these public benefits. Not private investments, but public benefits that any citizen should receive based on need. And redlining was a simple policy where certain neighborhoods that had certain inhabitants, a line of red would be drawn around that, and that would be determined as an unsatisfactory place to invest for either a mortgage or for mortgage insurance, for either a primary residence or a business. In the case of Providence, the red line neighborhoods in 1934, this is an actual map of red line communities from the Providence City Archives that includes names such as Onlyville, Washington Park, Upper and Lower South Providence, Smith Hill, parts of Lippert Hill, now Mount Hope, Fox Point. If you lived in those neighborhoods, which were largely neighborhoods of color, people of color, by the mid-20th century, if you lived in those neighborhoods, your chances of receiving and benefiting from federally insured mortgage or a direct primary mortgage were simply impossible. And what's important to recognize, as I said 100 years before, with these urban racial riots placed upon every black community across the free North, across the United States, the chances are if you were black or brown and poor or some combination thereof, and you lived in a redlining community, you had little or no chance to have access to owning your own home or owning and maintaining your own business. And as Cortney said before, possibly the fast and surest path to middle-class financial security is owning a home and having that home and that equity to pass on to the next generation. That had been denied strategically and historically for people of color, starting with enslaved Africans and indigenous people, and now newly arriving immigrants such as Cape Verdeans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans and poor white folks who happened to live in these same communities side by side with men and women and families of color. So what's important to recognize, when we talk about racialized discrimination, it's not the American South. It's not the KKK of Georgia. It's redlining in urban policies and practices right here in the city of Providence, right here in the true blue North, and right here in the 20th and into the 21st century. And the next great public policy of the 20th century that further would extend and be a historical involvement of racialized discrimination is urban renewal. Now, it's important that you understand the demographics at that time. If I could take you back to 1965, 90% of the non-white people of Providence were Negro, or people of African heritage. We're still a few years away from Puerto Rican and Dominican migration, other migration that we see today and that we welcome today. So for the most part, if you were being racially discriminated in Providence before 1970, it was almost exclusively African heritage people. Unfortunately, as new people would arrive, they would face the similar discrimination based on ethnicity, based on income, based on sexual orientation, based on religion. What they perfected, what the institutions had perfected on African heritage people, they continued and evolved and placed on other men, women, and families as they arrived and looked to prosper and benefit in this city. But it's by the 1950s, the next set of federal policies to really begin to end poverty as it was seen, to reduce blight and slum, and clear some of the slums that were created by the racialized discrimination and economic isolation by the larger government systems at a local, state, and federal level, and begins the urban renewal program. Urban renewal, which James Baldwin, probably one of the greatest African heritage authors and poets and literary critics of the 20th century, would coin it as Negro removal, because any of us who were part of those communities and families at that time knew that the urban renewal communities, where blight was removed, where homes were taken, where properties were lost, were almost exclusively and consistently communities of color. And in Providence, places like Lippitt Hill, today a part of the Mount Hope neighborhood, Washington Park, South Providence, West Elmwood, Smith Hill, all those communities were significantly deconstructed, not through racial riots, but through formalized city, state, federal public policies and enactments. And in fact, in Lippitt Hill, we know through documentary evidence over 400 families of color were displaced, almost all permanently, by the efforts of the city in its urban renewal programs. Because again, I just want to point out, Rhode Island did not pass a fair housing law until 1965. So if you were poor, and you were of color, and particularly a woman, and you were displaced from your home, you had no recourse. In fact, Upper South Providence was ghettoized and created as a poor minority ghetto through the city's deliberate actions of deconstructing Elmwood, West Elmwood, Lippitt Hill, Mount Hope, Fox Point. Because those families of color had only one place, if they wanted to stay in Providence, where they lived, worked, and worshiped for generations, there was one place where they could find an apartment and live, and that was Upper South Providence. And I just want to be clear, these policies were being played out in every city across America on a consistent and an effective basis. And I just want to give you a sense of the physical imagery. We were able to have access to the city's GIS mapping systems, and this is Lippitt Hill neighborhood from 1952. If you look to your right, you see what is North Main Street, and then you look to the top, which still exists, is Mount Hope High School and athletic fields, and then it's bounded by Only Street and Doyle Avenue and Camp Street. It's a very compact urban city neighborhood where people are living, working, and worshiping. Through the Black Heritage Society at that time, we documented 125 Black-owned businesses, home-based businesses, at that same time within this area. Over the next several years of urban redevelopment and taking down nearly every single one of those properties, that entire area is wiped off the face of the map. It looks like Hiroshima. Every single one of those families who were displaced from that area were tracked by the Urban League and the Providence branch and the NAACP. Most left Providence. Those that remained went to Upper South Providence. Some went over to West Elmwood with families and friends, and then West Elmwood was deconstructed with the Route 10 in the industrial park and the filling of Mashpond Pond. So what's absolutely important that you recognize is the entire elimination of largely black communities or African heritage communities was not an act of racists or KKK members riding in on horses and burning crosses. It was a formalized public policy to reclaim communities for taking away from non-white inhabitants. And what's fascinating to me is, as a historian and working across New England, today, the earliest indigenous and African heritage communities of New England, the most prominent communities dating back to the 17th and 18th century, are today called Beacon Hill in Boston, Historic Hill and Bellevue Avenue in Newport, and College Hill in Providence. People of color can barely walk through those neighborhoods anymore, never mind buying a home or operating a business, in communities that they built, in communities that they lived in. So the third part is, what does this all bring us to, this history? It's the establishment of our Municipal Reparations Commission. And as the mayor had said, this commission was established with really understanding the history through our truth reporting and our documentation, through reconciliation, bringing this back to the people and having them recall and reconcile the lives that their immediate family members in many cases. I mean, if we can talk about slavery, that's 200-300 years ago. When we talk about urban renewal, that's 50-60 years ago. There are people that live today or a generation removed from that devastating impacts. And through the work of the commission, we were able to slowly move the slide. We were able to understand that this legacy of racialized discrimination was more than just providing 40 acres and a mule. It was more than just dealing with the slavery of John Brown, but more recognizing the gentrification, studentification, and complicity of Brown University today, or Rhode Island Hospital, or the state of Rhode Island, or the city of Providence, or financial and business institutions that still exist and still succeed within this city. So this commission, to the credit of the commission, they determined through the historical evidence, through the present day findings of fact, that they would define reparations as closing the racial wealth and equity gap. And that this racial wealth equity gap started with indigenous land taking and started with African enslavement, but it continued through the centuries, effectively and efficiently, largely ensuring that people of color were in the outside looking in to any opportunities for prosperity in this great city, or this state, or this country. And the commission also recognized that the use of COVID-19 American Rescue Plan dollars would be a catalyst. This is not a transformative process. This is a catalytic process. The goal was to establish the history, to establish need, and to begin to create programs and services that could fast track and leverage other public-private contributions to begin to provide long-term sustainable investments in closing this racial wealth and equity gap within the city, and particularly within families of need, families who, based upon the eligibility criteria of the commission, is indigenous, African heritage, and let me just qualify what we mean by African heritage. That is not only those who are directly tied to the African diaspora and African slave trade, but anyone that has an African heritage, who could be African Latino, African Caribbean, Cape Verdean, biracial, multiracial, indigenous people. It reflects the men and women and families that exist to this day in this city who still deal with the legacy of an indigenous land taking and African enslavement. And then the third qualifier is qualified census tracts. Since we're using American Rescue Plan dollars, they require that we invest in those qualified census tracts, which are effectively low and moderate income communities that still exist to this day. And then the fourth criteria is residents facing poverty. residents that are facing either 50% below the AMI or 30% devastatingly poor. Again, our goal is not to have Oprah Winfrey move to Providence and benefit from this. Our goal is to invest in the people and the families of greatest need that include race, that include ethnicity, that include income, and include zip code. So the final investments that we're looking to do and it's exciting for us to be able to join with the United Way as a starting point because we see ourselves working with the Rhode Island Foundation, the state of Rhode Island, private foundations, through an 11-point investment strategy that begins to go to the heart of building equity in investments in the people who are in the outside looking in because of deliberate federal, state, city, public, private policies and practices. Home ownership, workforce training, directly investing in capacity building within nonprofit, particularly nonprofits dedicated to BIPOC and low and moderate income neighborhoods and communities. Establishing a dedicated fund to reinvest in those urban renewal communities that still are facing economic disparity and challenges. And as the mayor has been saying consistently, as a part of this practice, one of the great announcements we'll have soon in the next few months is the reclaiming of the former Urban League site on Prairie Avenue as a site that can be brought back and led by the people of that community in this city in becoming a hub of opportunity for those residents and for the people of Providence. And then most importantly, creating a series of investments in education and scholarships so that every student in this city, regardless of zip code or color or race or ethnicity or where they might live, have an opportunity to come and participate in a College Unbound program, and then eventually a URI, or eventually a Harvard Law School. Give them that choice and that chance, because unfortunately, because of the history of racialized discrimination, people of color for nearly 4 centuries were never given the basic chance to be a full citizen of this great city, this great state, and this great country. So let me just close with what I think the next steps are, if I can get to this final slide, and why I think it's important for the partnerships together. Harvard University, Georgetown, Brown have all come out very boldly and recognized their participation in at least the slave trade and slavery, and have suggested a series of programs and investments, but it's a bit of a top-down approach. What's most important of the work of Rodney and Ray and Wanda and Kyle and the commission is that this would be an investment strategy that organically starts with the people. So rather than having bureaucrats like me, or educational institutions, or financial institutions, or state government tell what people need to have or what they should have, this process begins by coming to the people and allowing the people to prioritize what their needs are, and then allow those institutions to invest in those programs and services. That's reparations. That's reparative justice. Take the wealth and transfer it to the people, the families, the BIPOC institutions who know what can be done, and if they had the capacity, will get it done. And that's what reparations is, giving the people of color within the communities and neighborhoods that they live, work, and worship a chance to build their own destinies in this city. So thank you for this opportunity. We look forward to answering questions you have. But again, thank you, United Way. Thank you, Met School, for being a host for this. We greatly appreciate it.
Man. So Keith not only went through 400 years in about 25 minutes, he also looked forward 100 years in the next 10. We'd like to say thank you again. Please put your hands together for this in-depth presentation, but also for Keith's thoughtful leadership. Next, I would like to welcome and thank Dr. Akilah Dulin for facilitating this afternoon's conversation. Dr. Dulin is an associate professor in the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brown University School of Public Health. Dr. Dulin obtained a Ph.D. in medical sociology from the University of Alabama at Birmingham in 2007 and joined Brown University in July of 2012. She's affiliated with the Center of Health Equity Research. Most recently, Dr. Dulin has partnered with the United Way of Rhode Island to produce the first in a series of reports focused on the state of Black Rhode Island. This report was on home ownership, and you'll find a copy of it in your folders. Again, we're thankful to you, Dr. Dulin, for your time this afternoon and welcome you to begin the discussion.
I'd like to thank you, Kyle, for such a wonderful introduction, and I'd love to thank United Way Rhode Island for such a phenomenal partnership and allowing me the opportunity to be at such an incredible forum, much needed. I really much admire the work that's being done in the city and the momentum behind it. So without further ado, I will get to why we are here for this section by introducing the panel. We have Rodney Davis, who's a member of the African American Ambassadors Group and chair of the Providence Reparations Committee. We have Dr. Sylvia Spears, who's the Vice President for Administration and Innovation here at College Unbound. We have Melina Lodge, who is the Executive Director of Housing Network Rhode Island. And we have Raymond Two Hawks Watson, who's the founder and CEO at Providence Cultural Equity Initiative. So panelists, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with the first question. So closing the racial wealth gap requires policy changes and other resources in areas such as education, housing, small business ownership, employment, and including more Black, Indigenous, and Latino people in positions of senior leadership. How have you and or your organization been involved in reducing the racial wealth gap for Indigenous, Latino, and Black communities? Anyone can start.
I'll kick us off. And how's everyone doing this afternoon? Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, just for a little bit of background, 501c3 nonprofit based here in Providence. Our mission is to steward and ambassador Rhode Island's cultural sector and economy. And I share that because in July of 2021 to about February of 2022, my company had the opportunity to collaborate with Roger Williams University on phase 2 of Mayor Elorza's Truth-Telling, Reconciliation, and Reparations initiative. So we were directly involved with engaging with individuals who either were directly impacted or had generational impacts from urban renewal in Providence, focusing on 4 particular neighborhoods, Fox Point, West Elmwood, Upper South Providence, and Lippet Hill. I personally have generational ties to Fox Point and Lippet Hill. And then we actually engaged those individuals to get firsthand from them what the experience was like from their perspective of someone being hit by urban renewal here in Providence. And ultimately what they wanted to see to be done in order to repair the harm that was done to them. And that helped to inform the fantastic Reparations Commission report that recently came out. So in terms of what we've been doing to address those, I would say being actively engaged in the City of Providence's Truth-Telling, Reconciliation, and Reparations initiative, and then feeding feedback directly from the communities that were impacted on how they think that those issues should be addressed. And that's probably going to be where most of my conversation is this afternoon when we're engaging and wanting to address these things. The people who are actually impacted or who are being impacted, what do they want? And that's how you start to address it. So I'll stop my remarks there.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sylvia Spears, as you know, Vice President for Administration and Innovation at College Unbound. That means I'm an educator. And have been an educator for a very, very long time. Working in traditional institutions, some mostly in higher ed, although I started teaching pre-K, believe it or not, but mostly in higher ed. And all of my work in higher ed has been centered around changing higher ed. And then I found College Unbound. That is a very different model of education. A model that centers community, that centers the experience of people who have been left out of the educational enterprise in a way that serves them well. And so the work that I lean into and my colleagues at College Unbound is really around how do we open doors, create access where access has been denied, and then center that work that occurs in the experience of individual students, of community that they seek to serve. And so it's the same theme of how do we create an environment and get out of the way so the talent and expertise of folks in community is actually what is lifted up. We create just the container where we can reflect back at people what is already there, their own greatness, their own talent, their own knowledge, their own expertise, so that they can obtain this thing called a bachelor's degree. The challenge is that we know access to education is a fundamental stepping stone to building wealth. The problem is not all education is equal. And so you've got this catch-22. If you're in the right neighborhood, you can get the right education. But if you're in the wrong neighborhood, you get the wrong education, or education that doesn't serve you, or education that doesn't see you. And so how do we both think about rethinking, transforming education and all of the policies and practices that have made education have the outcomes that it does? And lastly, I'll say, my colleagues at College Unbound hear me say this at least once a week, systems are designed to achieve the results that they do. And if you listen to what Keith just shared, that system has created the outcomes that we live every day. And wealth inequality is a present day and continuing evidence of past and continuing discrimination and oppression. And so until we interrupt that in small ways, in big ways, and across all of the systems, whether it's housing, education, nonprofit organizations, industry, we'll continue to replicate that same cycle. So it will take all of us and many others to actually stop what's already in momentum in our society.
There's a song by Mahalia Jackson, I'm going to live the life I sing about I'm going to live the life I sing about my song. And when I think of music, indulge me for a second. I want you to listen to something real quick. This is what I grew up with. And this is what. Good time. Anytime you meet a patient. Listen to the words. Good time. Anytime you meet a friend. Good time. Anytime you're out from under. Not getting hassled, not getting hustled. Keeping your head above water. Making a way when you can. Temporary layoffs. Good times. Easy credit rip-offs. Good times. Scratching and surviving. Good times. Hanging in a jar. Good times. Ain't we lucky we got 'em? Good times. Good times. Those were good times. And so that programming, that culture that was pervasive in everything. I was not supposed to be a homeowner, never mind go to college. When I lived in a housing project for most of my life, prior to that, I was in three foster homes here in the City of Providence, all within 5 minutes of walking from here from the Met. I was not supposed to be one of those individuals to buy a home, to be prosperous, to think about an education. When I graduated from Rogers High School in Newport, I was told to get a good job. I was not told to think about going to college. So it's reprogramming that and telling that story of why we have to change that. Because we have to tell others about it, because if you look at history, history will erase just about everything in order to be able to justify its own means. And so as a result, one of the things that I feel that I have to do is always tell the story and tell others to keep telling that story, because that's how we're going to make change.
Is this on? Yeah, I don't have any fancy music. Melina Lodge, Executive Director of the Housing Network. The Housing Network is the trade association of nonprofit housing developers and community development corporations across the state of Rhode Island. We have 17 members who have built approximately 80% of the affordable housing units in this state. So very grateful for all of their efforts. I just get to be their mouthpiece, generally speaking. Sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't. But I think within the workspace, the Housing Network undertook an effort, feels like a lot longer, but 5 years ago, to spearhead a collective impact initiative called Homes RI, which looks at how do we bring cross-sector collaboration to housing policy and housing advocacy, in recognizing that housing is, while four walls and a roof, is often infrastructure that supports other goals, workforce development goals, educational attainment goals, and how could we start to get voices, who don't always care just about housing, to talk about housing as necessary building blocks to achieve these other things. And I think we are an organization, I'm white, clearly, and our leadership is largely white. And so I think one of the ways that we've been able, or we've really embraced this idea of how can we make sure that we are really centering around increasing racial, working around racial disparities, is to acknowledge white privilege and to just acknowledge that that exists, and it isn't so much problematic that we have it, but how we use it. And so always being mindful that when we have seats at the table, that it isn't our seat necessarily, that we're representing somebody else, and to really challenge ourselves to push back around whether we are the right entity to hold that seat at the table, or if we need to make space for somebody who can come to the table, and to make sure that we steward them into that role so that it doesn't necessarily get unfilled. At the organizational level, we've really looked at how do we reduce barriers to employment to ensure that we are able to have it. We are a very small staff, we have 6 people, to make sure that we have as much racial diversity as we can. We've also, as an employer, embraced not a livable wage, a housing wage, which is actually higher. Our starting salary in our organization, regardless if you have a high school degree or a college degree, is $22.50, because that's what it costs to rent the average 2-bedroom apartment in this state. And I think really doing a lot of internal work to continue to educate ourselves around how white supremacy shows up in organizational culture, and to really make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable and safeguarding against some of the practices that, I really learned a lot, like I wasn't even aware, were a thing. It's just been such a part of my life growing up. And so how have we really embraced creating space for us to learn and to hear what other people have to contribute? And I would say lastly, acknowledging that sometimes the best way to be a leader is to be quiet, and to step aside and support people who are coming from a place of lived experience, who know something different than I know, but equally valuable.
I just want to add one Keith dropped a lot of stuff in this space. And as an Indigenous and Black woman, there are waves that come with what he just shared. And if you're living, breathing, and in your body right now, what Keith shared should have had an impact on you. I mean, you should feel a little rocked. And so I don't want us to oh, that was a nice history lesson, and yes, we're motivated because we're good liberal people. Let's create positive change in Rhode Island. You should feel it. And we should breathe a little bit in that, because for many of us who have long roots in Rhode Island, these are our people. If you're Black and brown, the folks who were affected you're the descendants of those folks. Those are your ancestors. If you're someone who identifies as white and you've been in Rhode Island and have people in Rhode Island, some of the folks who did some kind of stuff are your people. And there are people, all of us, because some of our folks intermarried by choice or by force. There are reasons why there are Native folks in Rhode Island called Brown and Jackson and just Johnson, do the whole names. And so I just want us to sit for a moment with the power of what we just heard, because we can move and do really powerful work from the place of our intellect, and it's important that we use our good brains. But we also have to know that we're moving into territory where history lives in us. And the future also lives in us. And so the possibilities for change and for imagination, for a reconciled world, a reconciled Providence, a reconciled Rhode Island actually exist. And can we hold both? The tragedy and the possibility of what is to come.
I hate to go after such powerful words, but I do have to ask one more question. And not to make light of the situation, but considering, as you mentioned, we can introduce policies, we can create policies, ideally in conjunction with communities who are most impacted by said policies. How can we ensure that the policies that are being developed reach Latino, Black, and Indigenous communities? Because we can make a policy all day, but it means nothing if the community is not being served by said policy. So if I could just ask each of you to follow up on that question, that would be great.
So I think one of the most effective strategies that I've seen, I had the very fortunate blessing, an opportunity to run the Mount Hope Community Center for about 9.5 years on Camp Street, which is the neighborhood where my family was from. And what I realized over there in engaging with the community is that I think we do too much of BIPOCing these communities and minoritizing these communities, and then treating them all as if because they're BIPOC or communities of color or minorities, we can just one fit all of them and it'll be taken care of. We don't acknowledge the differences between these communities. We don't acknowledge a lot of times the conflicts that are taking place in these communities. And then after we don't pay any attention to that, when we get the outcome that we should get, which isn't the outcome that we said we wanted, we then want to talk about what's wrong with the communities. To me, that's the biggest problem. It's the individuals who are in the positions of authority and power and have the access, utilizing the communities to achieve their own interests and goals rather than putting themselves in a position to make sure the community is achieving their goals. And then, of course, when it doesn't work out, you're in a position to then explain away what happened. So when I'm dealing with these communities, the first thing I say to myself is, I don't know what I need to know when I'm engaging with these communities, so let me put myself in the mindset of first understanding what these communities want. Then I try to do this amazing thing of actually doing what they want. Not fitting it into what I'm doing and what part can I take here, you know, but actually doing what they want and being an advocate for that. I think that we need to deal with all of those communities as individual communities. And it's very interesting to me, just for another perspective on it, we have this concept called white, right? A community that's called white, but I know Irish people, I know Italian people, I know Portuguese people, so outside of when we're conglomerating them, I'm not very sure that these people are all the same. And I don't think that any of them, except being treated as just this white conglomerate when it comes to their issues. The Armenian issues are not white issues, they're Armenian issues, right? When the indigenous and black folks were having an issue with the statue, Columbus statue, it was the Italian community that came out to support it, right? So we have to get away from this generalizing sort of thing, which really comes from chasing after dollars, right? The feds or some foundation puts out an agenda that we want to give money to minorities this year, and all everyone's programming gets structured around what the dollars are for this year or the next 3 years. And then when that funding stream's over, everyone's program will restructure around, and the only ones who get harmed and taken advantage of that in the process are the communities that's supposed to be getting service, because as everyone's programs restructure and realign, everyone keeps their jobs. There you go. But what about the people that were supposed to be serviced? And when I looked into my community, I realized, oh wow, this has been going on for generations. I looked and saw how much money came through urban communities before when I was a kid, and I said, well, what on earth is going on? So to me, it's fundamentally how we view and engage with these communities. And if we keep cookie cuttering, if we keep pivoting to chase funding, it's never going to change. We'll never close the racial gap, and we should stop pretending and fooling ourselves that we will. Really what we're trying to do is continue to make our careers lively off of other people's experiences, and I think that that's a really shameful sort of perspective. I don't want to suggest that that's what most people are intentionally doing, but I'm also of the mindset that my intentions don't mean much when it's taking advantage of someone else's life. And from a professional standpoint, my intentions should really mean nothing. It should be about the outcome of my efforts. So those are my thoughts.
I'll go next just to go down the line. I couldn't actually agree more with what was just said. And I think this idea around doing for seems to be a pervasive attitude rather than with. And so how, this is all community-based work, and so really I think leaving ego at home is really important because everything that we're doing, to your point, should be centered on the work and ensuring that the outcomes that are achieved are the ones that we set out to and not something else. But that's not really the question that was asked. I think, you know, in implementing the strategies, it's really important to have the people who are supposed to benefit from the programs at the table to make sure that these are actually benefits. Sometimes we've conceptualized programs that we think are beneficial to people, but that actually don't reduce harm and create other harms or are extremely difficult to access. And I think to your point was then circles back to say, well, nobody used the program, so they must not need them. Not so much to say as, well, maybe they couldn't get to them. Doesn't mean they didn't need it, they just couldn't get there. And I do think it is important to have the people who are at the table have the power to actually make the decisions, because without them, I think it leads to this point of people thinking that nothing is achievable in the sense that, well, we weren't able to be successful. So it's really being able to engage people in positions of power who are your allies and your champions, and how do they then bring their networks to the table to say, this is something I believe in. Messenger really does matter, I think, when you're trying to change people's minds or bring people along to an idea that they're not necessarily rooted in. And so, you know, how our organization has relationships, how do we leverage those relationships to serve other people and to advance ideas that people might not be receptive to if they were being brought forth by another person, I think is a way that organizations can really participate in advancing goals of impacted communities.
Where's Miss Wanda? I think she left. But I feel compelled to do a little echo on something Miss Wanda frequently says, and somebody at CU actually echoed it today, and that is nothing for us or about us without us. And to me, that answers your question. And the challenge of the work is to know that we are deeply interconnected, and that if you seek to make change for some distant community that you empathize with, or you feel bad about, or you're challenged by, or you think needs uplifting, then no thank you. No disrespect intended, just no thank you. Because unless you see your challenge, your experience, your life intricately connected to mine, then the premise is flawed, and basically you're just trying to help me and make yourself feel good. Communities have strength and power of their own, and wisdom and experience and guidance, and we see that every day in CU students. If we get out of the way and move humbly, as you talked about, into community and sit with community, and I don't mean sit with, go do a focus group and leave. I don't mean sit with, ask them to do a questionnaire and never engage. I mean in steady and deep relationship that moves slowly over time, that maybe somebody would be willing to drop some truth on you. Won't happen in a meeting. It'll happen by you showing up every single day in some way, until that community says, maybe we can trust this organization. Maybe we can trust that person. And so, as Ms. Wanda says, nothing for us, that's charity, or about us. Don't do your good deeds for a community unless it's with us. And the quality of with is really in deep, long-term, committed relationship.
And leapfrogging off of that, one of the things I observe and think about every day when I listen to the news is that those who oppose us are in for the long game. They know how to pace so that, give it some time. Just give it some time. And as a result, we find ourselves regrouping, reassessing those things to which we need to hold them accountable for, because we haven't actually learned from their lessons. And, Audre Lorde said, you will not tear down the master's house with the master's tools. The thing is that some of those master's tools were stolen by us, stolen from us. And we need to reclaim them and use them and be present, and not, someone says, we're going to make this really great policy decision, and we put all these great things, and we have the show and the dance, and 6 months later, where are we? A year, a change of administration, a change of Congress, and all those things, those details that you need to be, you all said, right here, I remember, because they remember. They teach their children to remember. Don't forget. It was a joke, but it stuck with me when bringing up the word reparations in Western Coventry. It's like, they go from loving you in the name of Christ to like, oh, there's Satan right in front of me, because you mentioned money. But it's an interesting thing, and I'm like, why are you getting so heated about this? Why, I said, I drive up 95, you go up right near the Thurbers Avenue curve, and you see, in pain, call Wayne. On the other side, call the heavy hitter. So you are told from the beginning, if something isn't right, if you are injured, you should get compensation for your injury. Except if you are a black person or a person of indigenous descent here. And then it's like, you know, we have the facts. Well, that doesn't matter. We'll change the rules right now. So we have to be persistent and consistent in pursuing our goals and not forgetting, because again, they're in for the long game. We can't just do the sprint. We have to match them.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to thank our panelists and encourage us to continue the conversation at the networking event. I will turn it over to Kyle for call to action and closing remarks. Thank you all panelists so much.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. I feel like you're right, Keith, he dropped some bombs on us, and each time I hear him share this presentation, I learn something new. I think about the me in all of this. One of the urban renewal projects happened exactly over the place that my grandmother was born. She wasn't born at Lying In or Women and Infants. She was born at home, 33 Wickenden Street. That house doesn't exist anymore. It was demolished to build an off-ramp for a highway that doesn't exist anymore. When 195 was moved, that exit was no longer needed. So the fact that our family had to lose their home and not be paid market value, of course, but then be displaced to Benefit Street, to a new home that was reclaimed as part of another urban renewal project in preparation for University Heights. I feel like I'm getting emotional, but I think about black people here in Rhode Island and indigenous folks here in Rhode Island almost being nomads in our own city, in our own state. Each time you establish a community, you begin to build wealth, you begin to build an economy, to build a system of support and structure. It's demolished for the greater good. Whenever folks are asked to sacrifice, it's these populations who are giving the most. And you know, when I first joined the Reparations Commission, I thought about it, and I was pretty angry. Lamont's not here anymore, but we had some words when we talked about the 4 criterion to be eligible for reparations. I said, well, I can't believe we're creating another fund under the guise of the Black and Indigenous Reparations Commission that's going to support poor white people again. But I thought back to my own neighborhood, moving from Wiggins Village to Elmwood or South Side. On Sumter Street, my block, we had Black families, we had interracial marriages and families, we had Latinos, we had a family of Guatemalan immigrants who brought other undocumented members who lived in their basement until they could establish some sort of residency. We had poor white families. We also had wealthier white families, and they were the same families sometimes. They owned homes and rented to their poor family members. So our neighborhood, our community was actually comprised of many cultures, ethnicities, races. And when I think about how we lift ourselves up, it isn't by only supporting one. Our strategies have to be keen and focused. The consultants that we use have to be deliberate. The money that we invest certainly has to be reinvested in those who've been devastated by this racial wealth gap. But I feel like today, I had a lot more words. All I really could say is wow. So I'm going to close with saying thank you. I want to thank our panelists today. I want to thank you, Dr. Dulin, not only for your words and efforts here today, but for the work that you continue to do, recognizing that this economic disparity is a public health crisis. Using your knowledge, your intellect, your connectivity to the institution that we're going to be back and forth with for a long time to come to show how reparations can truly happen, to issue public policy recommendations that we can then enact, we can follow. And to Rodney's point, we can't play the waiting game. We have to be in it for the long haul. The opposition is here. I remember, God, I could talk forever, I'm sorry. But I do remember going to basic training, and there was a guy, he's a young cowboy from South Carolina. His name was Burgeon. And I know he's a cowboy because he used to always talk about cow tipping. Like, who is not a cowboy that has cows on their property that enjoys tipping them over randomly? But he used to always say, the South shall rise again. And he had a Confederate flag that he kept in his locker. And I said, oh, how silly is he? Doesn't he know we've passed those days? And now as I look around, not just in Western Coventry, the site of the last public Klan rally in Rhode Island, but as I look in the City of Providence, on the streets that we're talking about today, in Mount Hope, on Camp Street, downtown Providence, on Westminster Street, and I see rallies happening, motorcades driving by with the Confederate flag, the Nazi flag being displayed from the backs of trucks and cars and shotguns and automatic rifles, also being used to threaten and intimidate people who would stand up and otherwise advocate for change. I say those days are not past. We've got to be in this for the long haul. So my call to action to you today is to not give up, not lose hope. Please don't lose faith. Don't move away. We ask you to cast your vote, not just on election day, but show up to every city council meeting, every school committee meeting. Join us at the State House. Testify. Your vote is your voice. Your voice can exemplify your choice. This work, it's not done yet. We've made recommendations, but they're not real. The impact hasn't been made. So what we ask of you today is to commit to this work, to do the heavy lifting. When the link for the Matter of Truth report works, and you see that it's 9,000 pages long, please don't be discouraged. I say that, but every story that's contained within, every factoid, every data point is relevant to this argument, because these tactics that you see being displayed across the country and right here at our local state, they're not new. They were designed centuries ago and have been executed to perfection because, as we heard, the systems are working exactly as they were intended to do. So when we see game changers, people who will make a way out of no way and who will offer an alternative solution to addressing the issues of today, join them. I see one in the back of the room over there, Brother Juan, changing the way philanthropy looks in the state of Rhode Island. He created in the state of Rhode Island the first recognition or acknowledgement of Black Philanthropy Month in August, and has done a great job celebrating that. We recognize Doc. There are many, many others of you in this room, but when you see it and hear it, they may not be perfect initially, but add your voice, add your experience. Help perfect the idea. Help implement the idea, and then come back again and evaluate. So today I ask you, use your vote, use your voice, and commit to this work long term to ensure that the ideas that have been presented by the AAAG, by the Reparations Commission, that they become real for the people and populations that have been described in these reports. Thank you all. I'd love to thank Team United. You all did a great job in hosting. I want to particularly call out Zoya. You have been amazing. My colleague in crime, Roshni. My partner here on the policy team, Elijah. My manager, Larry, who had to leave us. He's got two teenage-ish boys. Alicia in communications, certainly Rodney. The entire team. We have Bonnie, who's always present. She shows up and shows out. She doesn't let us down. But I want to thank Team United. You all have been steadfast, particularly Roshni and Zoya, working with Hannah and team over the years. Not just today and not just for this event, but I want to thank you all because you're amazing, and I'm glad to be part of the best team. With that, I'll stop talking now. I want to thank you all for coming tonight because you all are rock stars, and I appreciate each and every one of you today. Thank you.